Okay, hello guys, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. I'd like to use philosophical underpinnings of applied behavioral analysis to analyze Russia and Putin in the concept of today's events that taken place in the Ukraine. Okay, I will start with the experimentation. As you know, experimentation is one of the philosophical underpinnings of ABA. So the Russian invasion of Ukraine is I'll call it experimentation, because basically it's an evaluation of how one event is influenced by the other. So Ukraine in this case is dependent variable, and Russian war tactics and Russian army is independent variables. But first let me go over experimentation as a concept. So experimentation is an evaluation of how one event is influenced by other. Ideally requires that all variables be controlled except the dependent variable. Experimentation factors under investigation are systematically manipulated, while effects on dependent variable are measured. Extraneous or confounding factors other than the independent variable or variables that could influence the dependent variable must be properly controlled. According to this definition, measuring correlation between one event and another is not experimentation. So what do we have? Now let's use Russia as an example. So again, we use experimentation definition in applied behavioral analysis to analyze dependent and independent extraneous variables. Russia is performing an experiment to see, so Russia is the experimenter, to see if they can occupy Ukrainian territory. Dependent variable is the independence of Ukraine. In this case, the independent variables are all Russian war tactics that they are using. If Russia does X, Y, and Z, those are going to be their independent variables. So extraneous variables is USA and NATO, and I would add also the Veda, the GATT. It's also extraneous variables. So now let's look at the whole thing. Russia is the experimenter, performing the experiment to see if she can occupy Ukraine, and so they are trying war tactics as their independent variables to see what the effect is on the state of Ukraine the independent variables have. And also we have to see how it's affected by extraneous variables, which is the US, NATO, Veda, the GATT, angels, whatever, etc. Okay, now let's go to the next one, pragmatism. Pragmatism is verifying that you are right. Something is only true if it can be verified. Okay. So another definition, pragmatism is the truth or value of a scientific proposition depends on the extent to which it leads to success with respect to some goal. So the goal of Russia is to occupy Ukraine. So now let's look at Russia through the prism glasses of pragmatism. Russia always wants to prove that they're supreme world power, right? Putin wants to show that he's supreme leader. Russia wants to show that they're supreme world power. But most of the time they try to prove it, they fail. For example, Caribbean Missile Crisis, they failed. Cold War, they failed. Afghanistan, they failed. Chernobyl disaster, they failed. Submarine Kursk, they failed. So hopefully the war in Ukraine, they will fail as well. This is pragmatic vision. So this is, I used Russia, now let's use Putin. It's the same thing right now, but a little bit different. So Putin tried to show how strong the Russian army is. He tried. But in reality showed the impotence of Russian armed forces losing in Ukraine. So this is pragmatism is done. Now let's move to empiricism. What is empiricism? Empiricism is measurement and observation. And it should be objective. Now, it doesn't depend on our belief system, on our personal opinions and views. So empiricism entails objective measurement of carefully defined phenomena and detailed description of procedures. This is characteristic of controlled experimentation. Empiricism maintains that knowledge is derived from experience as opposed to introspection, common sense, authority, etc. Okay, so let me go back. So we're in the, let's compare Russian media covering the war, or covering anything, not just the war in Ukraine, covering the news, and the West media. So we're in the West measuring, we're talking about Ukraine right now, we're in the West measuring what's happening in Ukraine, measuring how. In other words, how many lives have been lost, or on each side, how many cities are occupied, and for how long. When Russia took Kherson, Ukraine took it back. They tried to occupy Kharkov, Ukraine took it back. They tried to occupy Kyiv with 40 miles military convoy, armada. It was destroyed by Ukrainian army. So, but we analyze how many cities are occupied, how strong boundaries are holding, how many supplies each side has. Those are all of the things that we can objectively measure, and by doing so we are being empirical. We are not using some superficial forces, propaganda, the way we want things to be. We being empirical, we look at the data. So the West media analyzes empirically, meaning objectively, of course, what's going on in the war between Russia and Ukraine. Compared to Russian encounters, compared to Russian media propaganda, which looks at the things subjectively and not pragmatically, because the things they say can be verified. So this is the empiricism. With empiricism we are done. Now let's move to the next one, parsimony. Okay, and again, parsimony, I want to go over the general definition. Parsimony, when multiple explanations for a phenomenon are available, select the simple. So keep it simple, basically. Right? Parsimony is about being as simple as possible, and then going to more complex explanation. Okay, so yeah, so the most parsimonious explanation requires the fewest assumptions and is built on an existing foundation of knowledge or rules. Okay, so in case of Russia, to put it simply, parsimony of Russian-Ukraine war. It's the war of democracy against dictatorship. When I think about Russian-Ukraine war, I'm sorry. When I think about Russian-Ukraine war, and if you try to think about Russian-Ukraine war, about why it's happening, it's because Russia is ruled by dictators who think that they are the most powerful people in the world. And if we take Putin, Putin is afraid of Ukrainian democracy, that it will spread to Russia. So it's the war of basically democracy against dictatorship. That's why the whole world is helping Ukraine, because Ukraine is democracy. So opposite to parsimony and pragmatism are conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories are not a part of the parsimony because they are not scientific in nature, not pragmatic because they can be verified. And what Russian propaganda is using, it's all bunch of conspiracy theories. So the science doesn't live there. And eventually it will work. It works already. It's working against them because they can't analyze the situation objectively. They live in a delusion. Okay, so now let's talk about determinism. In determinism, when it comes to Russia and Russian-Ukraine war, what is determinism? Determinism is lawfulness of behavior. All events have causes and occur lawfully as a result of other events. Cause and effect. Behavior is lawful and orderly. The world is orderly and predictable. So now, what do we see here? Cause and effect. Russia attacked Ukraine. Ukraine fought back. Russia attacks Ukraine. Ukraine fights back. Okay, now we're getting more interesting. Selectionism in this whole picture. Okay, what is selectionism in applied behavioral analysis? Why is it important? I wanna look at the definition, and then we'll go into Russian-Ukraine definition. So selectionism, features and behaviors are selected throughout an organism's lifetime. That's apparent. Apparent is during our life span. Or over the history of the species, that's evolution as a result of consequences. Evolution is phylogeny. Okay? We have ontology and phylogeny. Ontogenic. Okay, so let's use again Russia and Ukraine as an example. Let's use Ukraine. So selectionism, one more time. Selectionism, the things that persist have been selected because they are helpful. Ukraine selects the West because it's more supplies and the ways to victory, more weapons, and they will select it as long as it's working and reinforced. Okay, replication in Russia-Ukraine conflict. In this case, we have replication of failure, repeating the outcome. So Russia always tries to do the experiments, and most of the times those experiments fail, like Afghanistan, right? Cold War, etc. But Russia keeps trying and keeps losing. Cold War, Chernobyl, Kursk, Afghanistan, and now Ukraine. Okay, so those are goals of behavioral analysis. I went over goals of behavioral analysis as a science, and I use it to analyze Russian-Ukrainian conflict. Now I want to go into description. So let's start with higher level of definitions. Description is our operative definition. In our Russia example, the number of soldiers that are fighting, equipment, etc. That's description. Based on description, we can make prediction. Prediction is after observing the data, collecting the data baseline. We can start making correlation. And with our example is when Russia has X number of men, Y number of ammunition, we can predict if they will attack or not, basically their next move. So we first would use description to analyze the data. We describe what's happening, and then based on data and description, we can make prediction. Okay, in the highest level of scientific understanding is control. Control is going from correlation to causation. So causation is the same as control. It's the same meaning, and the control is the highest level of scientific understanding. So it's also called functional relations. Also the same thing. Let me make a note here. Functional relation, control, causation is the same thing. Okay, so Russia is dependent variables. If we look from another angle, Ukraine, US, and NATO is independent variables. Weather, God, extraneous variables. So functional relation is established when science confirms what has been predicted. So prediction and correlation. What is prediction and correlation in Russia-Ukraine conflict? When Russia has lower number of supplies, then they don't attack. That's why Ukraine targets Russian supplies, supply storage, etc. Full. Okay, so control and causation, functional relation. How? Because for any side to win, they have to establish control. They have to establish functional relation between dependent and independent variables. So we want to interrupt. Ukraine wants to interrupt Russia's supply chain, so they attack less or don't attack at all. So what do we see on the war stage? We see that 55 countries supply Ukraine with weapons, ammunition, food, everything necessary for victory. And Russia has sanctions, so Russia is limited in its supply. It has some supplies for some time, but those supplies are gonna run out eventually. And Ukraine will take over. One more time. Causation is a conversational term. Control is a more scientific term, and functional relation is a math term. We use it when we do graphs. Okay, so now let's talk about Putin. Putin is the client. Russia was the client, now Putin is the client. So respondent behavior is largely phylogenic, so we can't. It's hard to analyze his respondent behavior. His respondent behavior is a product of Russian culture. That's his respondent behavior. His ontogenic behavior is his operant behavior. Every action that he takes has a consequence. And that's everybody. Every action we take has a consequence. That's operant behavior. So operal conditioning is the process by which you learn operant behavior. So if we think in ABA terms, what made Putin the way he is, because we're not using Freud. Freud is psychoanalysis, consciousness. We use applied behavioral analysis, something that we can see and touch, basically. So if we think in terms of ABA, what made Putin the way he is, we think about operant conditioning. In other words, the environmental events that shaped his personality. So now let's talk about influence of selectionism on Putin's personality. He graduated from KGB school. He received Soviet education. He has Soviet philosophy. Fall of the USSR also influenced his personality, and he talks about it himself. He talks about it openly. That it was, for him, it was a big catastrophe. So to summarize it in terms of selectionism, towards his behavior was reinforced throughout his life and education, and through his work life, his education, his personal life, all this, but it all happened in the Soviet system. It was reinforced in the Soviet system. That's why he wants to go back to Soviet Union. You have to understand this. He was successful in the system, personally, in education, in job career. He was successful in this system. He is the product of this system. The system works for him, and he wants to go back for the system. Democracy is something that he is afraid. That's new evolution, and he wants to stay away from this evolution. So he is the product of KGB, Soviet Union. That's part of his human evolution. He is the product of Soviet social system. Because he was successful in that old Soviet Union system that made him successful, he wants to go back to that system, and he will do anything to stay in the system. Democracy, what's happening in Ukraine, is very he views it as dangerous for him, because it affects his rule, his power. So now let's talk about 3 terms contingency of Putin's invasion, or Russia invasion. So antecedent number 1 is democracy in Ukraine, because Putin is afraid of democracy. We know when he came to power in Russia, he censored the media, freedom of speech, etc. Antecedent number 2, he hoped that this war will elevate his rating to stay in power. New territories, he wants to be like Peter the Great. He said it. That's him. This is description. This is objective data, because it's based on what he said. And it brings us to his behavior. War. He starts the war. And what's the consequence of war? Ukraine fights back. This is something that he didn't expect. So the experiment didn't go well for Russia and Putin. So, but in in ABA, when we work with children with ASD, in therapy, we control the consequence. Here we see the opposite. He tried to control the consequence, but he can't. He couldn't. So the consequence that Ukraine fought back was predictable, because let's look at it from other point. In the media, it was the thing that Ukraine will fall in 3 days. It was in the Western media as well. It was, in my opinion, it was purposeful disinformation, because, and I can back it up with the data, because Ukrainian army was trained and supplied with weapons. So Ukraine army was trained by NATO, right? It was supplied by NATO. So the media prediction, it's part of the game. The media prediction that Ukraine will fall was part of the winning agenda in the experiment where Ukraine is supposed to win. His experiment was that Ukraine is supposed to lose, but there is other experimenter, is the West. So in the West, maybe God, right? Maybe determinism, the law of evolution, and according to the law, determinism and the law of evolution, and maybe the West and democracy, Ukraine is supposed to win. So, but that's another experiment. So, but in Putin's experiment, he can't establish control over dependent variable, which is Ukraine. So his experiment failed. That's it. This is what I was trying to say. I hope you enjoyed it. I tried to think out of the box to make it interesting. And hopefully you enjoyed it. If you enjoyed it, I expect to see likes from you and sign up to my channel, because more is to come. All the best. I love you.